Welcome back. Sean here again at Boston Drum Center, and this is part 2 of our 12-inch tom tuning video. In part 1, we listened to 10 different tunings of this drum, and here in part 2, we'll recap our findings, we'll listen to 2 additional tunings, and we'll talk a little bit about how this tuning video relates to the other videos on our YouTube channel. So what did we learn in part 1? And let me preface this by saying that when I'm sharing what I heard in these recordings, it doesn't mean that you did too, or that you should have. This video is more about listening to the examples, drawing your own conclusions, and hopefully together we can come up with some useful techniques. In comparing our 3 different methods of tuning, I think that even tension, top and bottom, produced the cleanest, purest note, the most consistent note, without a lot of movement throughout. In the uneven tunings, the resonant head came through, especially towards the end of the note, and that produced an inflection either up or down, and a more complex note overall. The note may have been shorter in the uneven tunings, especially when we were higher on the top than on the bottom, but overall tension on the drum affected the sustain more than the relationship between the top and the bottom head did. And we discovered the concept of sister tunings where the total tension on the drum was the same, but the relationships between the top and the bottom heads were different. We were a quarter turn higher on the top or a quarter turn higher on the bottom. Those sister tunings produced roughly the same pitch. What was different was the inflection, or the shape of the note, and in some cases the sustain, the length of the note. And I think that's an important concept that you can use to really dial in the tone and the feel, the amount of rebound, of the drum. Take, for example, our first pair of sister tunings, which was 75 on the top, 80 on the bottom, and 80 on top, 75 on the bottom. If that's where you want to be pitch-wise, you might choose between those 2 different tunings based on the inflection, up or down, the sustain, or the amount of rebound. For a little less rebound, go 75 on the top. For a little more rebound, go 80 on the top. And don't forget that there's an entire universe of tunings in between. If you like what an even tuning does, you could split the difference, top and bottom. I'm not suggesting that we should be drilling down to fractional units on the drum dial, but remember, the drum dial isn't really necessary here. We're just using it as a reference. The concept here is that you can find the pitch that you want and really dial in the sound of the drum and the feel of the drum by tweaking the top and bottom heads in tandem, keeping the overall tension the same. And that leads us to explore tunings in between and outside of the 10 that we listened to in part 1. We've been working in quarter turn increments of the drum key and nice, convenient numbers on the drum dial, but there are infinite possibilities. What happens when the top and bottom head are less than a quarter turn apart, and what happens when they're more than a quarter turn apart? We're going to listen to 2 examples and then try to put them in context of what we heard in part 1. The first additional tuning is 82 on the top and 85 on the bottom, so a little bit closer than a quarter turn apart. This was actually the first example that we recorded as part of this project. Not being an expert user of the drum dial, I wanted to get a feel for what kind of readings we'd get and where the drum would sit, low, medium, and high. So I tried to replicate a tuning that I would use for my own 12-inch tom, which is probably medium-high, a little bit tighter on the bottom than the top, and this is what I ended up with. So let's give it a listen. Okay, I think that was about what we'd expect from a tuning between number 7 and number 9 of our original 10. The note was a little less complex than that of tuning 7, but not quite as pure as that of tuning 9. And we'll hear this in context in just a minute. Now let's find out what happens when the top and bottom heads are more than a quarter turn of the drum key apart. We tried to bring the batter head down to 75, so 75 over 85, or about a quarter turn lower than tuning number 7. In reality, this tuning sounded a little bit weird. We had to tweak it a little until we were at about 76 on the batter head. And even here, with this drum, with these heads, we're probably pushing the limits of where the heads are still working together and speaking the same language. On a different drum with different heads, tunings like this, or even more extreme, might be a little bit more usable. But let's take a listen. Okay, we won't draw this one out, but it sounded about as we expected it to. The two notes were distinct, and the combination was complex, almost like a chord. It actually sounded better in the recording than it did in the room at the time, but I could see this being something interesting to experiment with. Now for some context, we put together a sequence of those two additional tunings along with two tunings that we already listened to in part 1. Note that the resonant head stays at 85 throughout these 4 notes. And that illustrates what happens as the two heads get closer together. It was pretty short, only 4 hits, so let's listen to it again. Hopefully that's about what you expected to hear, having picked up on some principles and techniques over the course of this video. Now, let's conclude by backing up a little bit and discussing the origin of this tuning video. The idea to share our thoughts on drum tuning grew out of the other videos on our YouTube channel. They're demonstrations of drum sets, cymbals, snare drums, what have you, and we're watching one of them right now. We get a lot of questions along the lines of, how did you tune the drums in this video? And it's difficult to answer for a few different reasons. First, we've been at this a long time, so if we recorded and posted the video several years ago, I honestly don't remember how we tuned the drums. Next, although we used the drum dial here as a reference in this tuning video, generally we're not using the drum dial or any kind of tuning device other than the key, so it's difficult to give an objective answer. I might be able to listen to the video and try to pass along some general principles. For instance, the 12-inch Sonor tom heard here sounds a lot like our 80 over 80 tuning in part 1, but I'm not sure that my ear is good enough for that in general. Furthermore, in drum set demonstrations, we often showcase 3 different tunings, low, medium, and high. And throughout the course of the same video, you may hear all 3 tuning techniques that we've discussed here. To prepare for the video, I might tune the toms evenly, top and bottom, at a medium pitch, and that way when we're recording and we're a little more pressed for time, we can just come down a little bit on the batter head for the low tuning and come up a little bit for the high tuning. As a result, we're even in the medium tuning, but in the lower tuning, we're a little higher on the resonant side, and in the high tuning, we're a little higher on the batter side, because we didn't play with the resonant head at all. Now, we may treat snare drums and bass drums a little bit differently, especially snare drums, where in the lower tunings, when we're really trying to demonstrate a low, we're often coming down on the resonant head as well because it sounds weird if we don't. But even if you have to adapt them a little bit, The principles that we've discussed here in this tom tuning video should apply to the rest of your drum set as well. So perhaps in the future we'll try to pass along some more specific tips for those other drums. But in the meantime, hopefully you've learned enough here to make all of your drums sound and feel their best. Now take that drum key and go and experiment, and most importantly, have fun doing it. Thanks so much for watching.